our Disney podcast. My name is Amanda. I'm here with my lovely mother.
Hi, I'm Janette.
And today we're super excited. We're starting off the year with the Silver Era, the Disney animation movie era. So it was like a year ago at this point that we did a full episode just in general on the Disney movie eras. And this is specific to the Disney animation movies. So it's not all the live action movies or anything like that.
Okay.
We did a whole episode on that. And then we started going through the eras, era by era. And we are finally caught up to the Silver Era, which is super fun. So yeah, so we do have full episodes on the first two. So definitely make sure you go check those out. And we're actually going to do the Silver Era in two parts because there were so many notes for all of the movies in the Silver Era that I wanted to include in the overall episode that I was like, all right, we're going to split into two parts. So we're going to do part one today and then part two will be next week. So two parts for the Silver Era, which is exciting. I think some of the more future ones are also going to have to be in two, maybe even three parts.
So much.
Yeah, some of the eras have a lot of movies in them. So it's like, for instance, like the package era or the wartime era, the previous era only had like 5 movies in it technically.
Yeah, then they started ramping up.
Yeah, like for instance, like when we get to the Renaissance era, there's like 10 movies in that era. So like that one's and there's only 8 in this one technically. So, but all right. So the Silver Era is noted to be between 1950 and 1967.
Okay.
It's noted for its lush animation style, experimentation with new technologies such as xerography, and a return to fairy tales and animal stories that echoed the studio's earlier classics. So remember, right before this era, we're going to reference the wartime era a lot because that was coming, during and right after World War II. Disney and the animation studio were working with the U.S. government for like war propaganda type films, and they couldn't produce any full feature length films because just of the times they couldn't do the international, they couldn't distribute internationally, so they were kind of trapped within just a domestic release of movies, so they were losing a lot of money. So right now, let's remember the studio is losing money. They're in all these financial struggles from World War II. They're trying to stay afloat, and again, we have a whole podcast on the wartime era. So by the late 1940s, Disney, so when I say Disney, I'm just referring to Walt Disney himself. Disney was excited to get back into the more traditional feature-length films. He felt that these traditional films were the only way to restore the studio's reputation for artistic innovation and box office prestige. This era, the Silver Era, is also known as the Restoration Age as well too, or the Silver Age. Some people call them ages or eras, kind of the same thing. Okay. Yeah, but some people call it the Restoration Age of Disney animation since, again, it was kind of brought back, right? They had over 10 years of kind of flops, if we're being honest.
Right. Well, like you said, a whole lot of things came into that. Right.
By 1947, the studio was $4 million in debt. And in today's money, that would have been $60 million in debt. So Disney knew that he had to do something big, right? And so what do you think that big film was that brought the studio back? That came out in 1950.
Oh, I can't remember.
So it's the second princess movie, if that helps.
Second. Snow White was the first. Cinderella?
Yep, Cinderella.
Okay, Cinderella.
1950. And that,
I knew Snow White was already out.
Yeah, Cinderella. So Cinderella, we're going to get to it, but Cinderella basically saved Disney animation.
I can see that. I mean, but think about it. I mean, not only did it save Disney animation, think about what an effect it still has. I mean, that is amazing.
Yep, no, that is true. Yeah. So, all right,
I mean, Cinderella still has such an impact on everybody.
It really does. So now Disney had actually already adopted Charles Perrault's 1697, which is very interesting if you think about it, because a lot of people think that a lot of Disney films are based off the Grimm brothers. They're not. They're based off Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tales. Oh, wow. So that is what Disney had read.
I've even heard that. Well, I probably heard it when we went to the museum, but it went through my head. Okay.
So back in 1922, he had actually already done a cartoon short of Cinderella, and he actually almost produced a second version of the short in 1933 as part of the Silly Symphony series. But at the time in 1933, he wanted to expand upon the simple storyline with more visual gags and animated animals. Like he wanted to add the mice and the birds and everything. Right. And he wanted to add a more complex storyline. So by 1938, they realized that the story was becoming too dense to just put into like an animated short. So they're like, all right, maybe this is going to be a full featured film. So slated to be the full feature film by 1943, Cinderella started out with a budget of $1 million. But by 1945, the work on the film was halted. There was a few reasons for this. 2 of the writers at the time disagreed on storyboard, and then they were moved to work on the song in the South anyway, ironically enough. Originally, Maurice Rapt wanted Cinderella to be more rebellious. He was one of the writers, and he actually wrote a scene where she was actually throwing stuff at her stepfamily, and they locked her in the attic, and that was why she was contentious with their family. So this writer, he didn't want her to be a passive character like Snow White, where someone just kind of showed up and saved the day. But again, his ideas weren't loved by the studio. Disney didn't really like the idea of the princess like throwing stuff at people and being too rebellious. And eventually he moved off to film, and then he ended up leaving Disney Animation anyway. Well, too, of course, again, the wartime era, they just didn't have the budget or the funds or the time to work on a full feature length like this. So by 1946, though, the storyboard was back, and Walt Disney himself was very involved with his writers at this time. They decided to have the prince introduced earlier in the movie, similar to Snow White, but they also wanted to have that cat and mouse conflict between all the animals as well, too. They also wanted to show Cinderella's story more through all the barnyard animals as they observed her through her day-to-day activities. activities. Now we do see some of this still a little bit in the final feature of Cinderella
came out.
I feel like some of this got lost eventually.
Yeah, a lot of the barnyard animal thing didn't really.
Yeah, so we see some of it, but
right.
that original storyboard didn't necessarily stick either. All right, so now we're in 1947, and this is when Fun and Fancy Free had helped the studio be from $4.2 million in debt to only $3 million in debt. So
that was a big deal for
$1
them
million.
back then.
And it was around this time that Walt and Roy Disney, so Walt and his brother, they argued for weeks apparently about continuing the work to make Cinderella a full feature film. And at this time, Roy actually wanted Walt to sell the animation studio and retire with the money they had. But finally, Roy conceded, and he approved with Disney 3 full feature films that got greenlit fully in earnest with a budget. Cinderella was the first one, and then it would be followed by Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. So production of Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland were happening at the same time, with the two animation crews basically competing to see who would finish first.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
but within 1 year, by 1948, it was pretty clear that Cinderella was way more ahead of Alice at the time. And then Walt, because it was a little bit more ahead, Walt then fast-tracked it so it'd be produced first. And then plus, Walt Disney also wanted Cinderella to be the first, as it was more reminiscent of Snow White and that whimsical fantasy and love story,
and the princess
vibe.
idea, yeah.
Yeah, he just really loved the idea of Cinderella from the start, so of course he was going to want Cinderella to be pushed ahead a little bit faster. Mm-hmm. So then in 1948, the actors were hired to help with the animation through live action reference. We're going to see this basically with all the films in this era, that they all use live action sequencing. Okay. So that's basically when they have real life people kind of acting out the scenes, and then they film them, and then they sort of take their movements and they sort of draw on top of the movements for the animation. And it helps to speed up a lot of that animation process, as well as give more realistic movement and, like movement for clothing, for the mannerisms, even for animals too. So that's kind of what they had done. Again, they had done this technique with Snow White, Pinocchio, and Fantasia, so this wasn't like something new for them to start doing. Oh, it also said that this type of, the live action sequencing would also ensure pace, time, and timing as well too, for when the characters moved with one another. But because of this, the directorial perspective was more live action than animated, as an animated point of view can capture a lot more different angles that a live action cannot. So here they did do a lot more live action point of view. Now, I don't know a lot about animation, if I'm being honest, so sometimes some of this goes a little bit over my head, because I'm like, I've never animated a single thing my whole life. Right. But just to know, anyone who's into animation, that's just interesting. So the main live action reference for Cinderella was Helene Stanley, and she later also did Aurora in Sleeping Beauty, and she was also Anita in 101 Dalmatians. All right, so our two main storyboard and writers for this film was Eric Larson and Mark Davis. Their names are going to be brought up a lot throughout the Silver Era, honestly. And they were tasked with designing and animating most of Cinderella's scenes. Larson originally drew Cinderella to be 16 with braids and a pug nose, and that was when Disney just assigned Davis because he wanted to make her more of the exotic dame with that long swan-like neck. Right. Her appearance actually was also referenced a lot by Helene Stanley as well too. If you look at photos of them side by side, you can kind of see where they brought in a lot of inspiration from the girl who did her live action sequencing. Okay. All right, so some other little animation tidbits that I wanted to cover. So Disney pictured the fairy godmother to be a tall, regal character like the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio, but Milt Kahl, who was the lead animator for the fairy godmother, disagreed with him, and he had to really work to convince Disney to draw her more motherly and matronly, which I thought was interesting. Because sometimes you'll see Disney will disagree with his animators and he wins because he's the big boss.
Well, he's the boss.
But then other times you see that he didn't win and then his animators were right? Yes. So it's fun to see that back and forth between him and his animators. So unlike the human characters, all the animal characters did not have any live action sequencing, so this meant it just took a little bit more time for them to animate their scenes. But they did look at live action references for animals. So specifically, Disney basically disliked every way that Lucifer the cat was originally drawn by Ward Kimball, and he was in charge of doing a lot of the animals. And every iteration apparently of first ones of Lucifer, Disney said no to every single one. And eventually Disney saw Ward Kimball's own cat. So Ward Kimball had a six-toed calico cat, and he said, "That's your model for Lucifer." Okay. So he would end up being modeled after this really plump six-toed calico cat, even though he's more or less portrayed as a fluffy Persian cat. So if you Google what type of cat is Lucifer, he's definitely not a calico cat. He's basically a darker gray cat with kind of like a darker gray belly.
It looks like a Persian cat.
Even in the 2015 live-action Cinderella remake, they picked a Persian cat to portray Lucifer. Okay. So that's, in my head, that's always what I thought Lucifer was a Persian cat. All right, so by the late 1940s, Disney's attention was taken to other films like Treasure Island, and because he was no longer in the day-to-day, there were some delays that were occurring because he would return to Cinderella and then request all these changes, and then they have to go and make the changes, basically. Okay. All right, so 6 original songs were composed for the film, and then, didn't have any more notes on that. 6 original songs were composed. Some of the ones I have more notes on that. But nonetheless, by October 13th, 1949, the production was complete, and then on February 15th, 1950, the movie was released, and it was considered an immediate box office success along the same lines as Snow White was also an immediate box office
you could
success.
see why. I mean, people needed something like that.
Yep.
Right.
It was the 5th highest grossing film of the year and was also extremely successful in international box offices too, because remember, this was the first film they could release internationally as well.
Right.
The film's budget ended up being about $2.9 million, so almost 3 times the budget that they initially had done, but they had grossed over $182 million internationally over the course of like its entire run, basically. So because of its success, Disney was able to continue producing the films they were already working on, such as Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. And with the additional profits from the music sales, the publications, and other merchandising, Disney now suddenly had cash flow again to finance many of his other projects, like his own distribution company, because that was really important to him. At the time, he was still distributing through RKO. So again, not necessarily a bad thing, but he wanted to do his own distribution company. He also wanted to start his own television production too, which we'll see soon enough that's where the Mickey Mouse Club will start.
He wanted to be in control of everything.
And last but not least, not forget, this is 1950, so he also wanted to start doing other projects such as the Disneyland theme park. So the film was nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Scoring of a Musical Picture, Best Original Song for Bippity Boppity Boo, and the Best Sound Recording. It didn't win any of those things, but it was still nominated. And the film has been inducted into the National Film Registry of the U.S. Library of Congress in 2018 as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. All right, so that was Cinderella. So from Cinderella, our next one, as I said, is going to be Alice in Wonderland in 1951. So again, as mentioned, Alice in Wonderland was greenlit the same time as Cinderella was. And also real quick to say too, I'll have all my sources linked in the description of this podcast. Of course, there's a lot that I'm skipping over in these summaries just for the sake of time. But if you really want to deep dive into some of these movies,
and all this stuff,
you really can. Some of these movies have like full documentaries on the making of them too. There's, full TV shows, full movies just about them. I feel like we could always do like a full episode on maybe on some of our favorites to like go further into our favorites.
Movies, yeah.
But just to say that as well, because Alice I don't have as much information on, but there is a lot more about Alice. So again, Alice was greenlit at the same time as Cinderella was. Disney had actually already produced a short film based on Alice in Wonderland back in 1923 at the Laugh-O-Gram studio, which was the original animation studio he worked at. But when they went bankrupt, the film was never really seen, even though technically does still exist to this day. Then in 1932, Roy Disney picked up the film rights for Alice, but they were sort of beat to it by Paramount Pictures at the time, because Paramount Pictures secured their own rights for the film. Because remember, the story of Alice in Wonderland at this time was already in the public domain, so in theory, anyone could create a story around Alice in Wonderland. So Paramount Pictures made their own live action version back in the 1930s. You can still actually go find that version of it today. So at the time in the 1930s, Disney then went ahead with Snow White instead, and that's actually mentioned in when we did the Bronze Era, where we talked about that too. So throughout the 1930s, Disney had storyboard writers working on turning, again, Lewis Carroll's book into that full feature film. But again, the work was super slow. Disney wasn't really interested in it at the time because he felt it was a little bit stale to him at this time. By the 1940s, the animation studio kind of started to slowly pick up back on it. But again, Disney wasn't super enthusiastic about it, so it's definitely not a priority. Then by 1941, Disney considered doing an animated film starring a live action actress. So that's like when you have like animation, but there's like one person who's real, so to speak.
Oh, well, yeah, they do some of that in like a couple of different movies.
He considered doing that instead. But then again, with the debt the studio was in from World War II and not having that international revenue, again, he had to scale back all the projects and again, got shelved again, basically.
Right.
So by 1943, we're still in the wartime era, mind you, Disney tried to revive it yet again, but again, didn't move on very quickly. And it wasn't until 1946 that the movie went back into production and like more sequencing basically started to happen.
Amazing how he didn't give up.
Yeah, and at this time, he still wanted to do that animated film with a live action actress. So for years, he was thinking of doing that. But ultimately, he decided not to do this because he felt to do justice by the book, it would be better if it was all animated instead. So that's when it turned in 1946 to be a fully animated film. So there were a lot of scenes from the book that were cut either due to pacing reasons, like the characters of Mock Turtle and the Griffin, or just because of plot reasons, like the White Knight scene was cut, mainly because he wanted Alice to like learn the lesson, so to speak, on her own rather than learning it with the White Knight. Over 30 songs were composed for the movie, and the most for any specific Disney film. Over 30 songs.
In one Disney little movie.
Yeah, and many of these songs were only used maybe for like a few seconds, like for a short sequence of it. But also a lot of these songs ended up getting moved over to other projects such as Peter Pan and Cinderella. So some of these songs for Alice got moved over. Then others got cut during production or when characters or scenes ultimately got cut out too. So they did a lot of work on Alice and a lot honestly kind of got cut out. So on July 26, 1951, Alice in Wonderland premiered, although it had a very lukewarm reception at the time with very mixed reviews. So some critics felt like it was lacking in the heart and warmth of the other Disney films, and others said the storyline felt underdeveloped. So Alice cost $3 million to make, and they only got about $2.4 million back.
Wow.
So this was only about a $900,000 outright like loss for them technically in the, at the time. But even though it was kind of considered, it was kind of considered a flop though, especially in comparison to Cinderella, which just did fantastic the year before. So Disney experimented at the time though with TV programs around this too. And on Christmas Day in 1950, he had aired a 1 hour in Wonderland on NBC to try to promote Alice in Wonderland for the year afterwards. Again, that Disney never actually saw a re-release of Alice in his lifetime, though it wasn't until the 1970s that Alice became extremely popular, basically becoming a cult classic. So in the 1970s, Disney advertised the film as in tune with the psychedelic times and used radio commercials featuring the song White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. And that re-release in the 1970s
caught attention. Okay.
Yeah, it was so successful they did a re-release only a few years later, both in America and specifically in England as well. So again, it wasn't until the 1970s that Alice like blew up in popularity and became kind of what she is today.
I still didn't like I didn't like Alice. I was never a big fan of Alice. So I'm one of the reasons they didn't make that much money.
In 1951, you weren't born yet.
No, I wasn't born yet, but when they released it in the 70s.
In the 70s, that's when it became popular.
Yeah, it didn't interest me then either.
Yeah, well, Alice is one of my favorites.
Oh, really?
So
See, that's it. I know
Alice
you love
has always
Alice
been
in
one of
Wonderland.
my-
Alice in
that's-
Wonderland is not one of my favorites.
Yeah, so that's actually my handle on my Instagram is Almost Amanda X. So Almost Amanda comes from Alice in Wonderland, when the blue caterpillar tells her you're not Alice, you're almost Alice. And that's actually from Alice Through the Looking Glass technically, but I just love that idea because again, when you deep dive into Alice in Wonderland as well too, it is just so fascinating and so interesting.
Well, it's every Disney movie you got a deep dive.
Yeah, but I'm talking specifically more about the story, like how Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland. It is very interesting how that story came to be, and it's just so fascinating. I've listened to a lot of podcast episodes and like things just on Alice in Wonderland itself. So I will always love Alice in Wonderland. I will say though, the 1950 version of this movie is not my favorite iteration of it though. There's a lot of other iterations I like of Alice better, but I'm glad it did become popular because it is one of my favorites. I will say. Although I will say all the movies in the Silver Era low key are kind of iconic in today's
they're all
age.
iconic. Yes,
Like,
that's why I said that's why it's so exciting to get to this
flop.
point. Yes.
No offense to the wartime era, right? Where
like I said, there was all kinds of
those.
outside influences why it was not as good as it was in the Silver Era.
Yeah. All right. So now we're on to our third movie, which again was greenlit way back when by Rory and Walt Disney, which was Peter Pan in 1953. I know, another movie that will become a cult classic, honestly.
Classic.
So Disney originally wanted Peter Pan to be the second full-length feature film after Snow White back in the 1930s. But long story short, it took some time to secure the rights from Paramount Pictures. So it wasn't until the late 1930s that they had the rights to the movie and that they could start working on it in earnest. And then, of course, World War II happened, so it got shelved, right? But in theory, though, this was going to be the second full-length feature film. All right, so many different storylines were explored early on, such as Peter kidnapping Wendy as a mother to the Lost Boys, or Peter's backstory. But Disney really wanted to start the story in the middle of all the action, and he also felt like the kidnapping storyline was too dark. So they ended up just going off the OG Barry storyline, the person who wrote Peter Pan, of course, trying to get his shadow back, and Wendy wanting to see Neverland. So Disney really wanted Maude Adams to view an early reel of the film for her approval. I guess I should have mentioned this before, but Disney had actually seen the stage production of Peter Pan way back when, and that was what sparked his love for Peter Pan and why he wanted to work on Peter Pan. So Maude Adams was the original Peter Pan in the stage production that Disney had seen when he was a child. And now fast forward in the 1930s, 1940s, Adams was retired and teaching drama classes basically. So now in the 1940s, when they started working on Peter Pan again, Disney wanted to send her a reel of Peter Pan to kind of get her thoughts on it to see what she thought. But Maude Adams refused Disney's proposal, stating that Peter, whom she created, was to her real life and blood, while another's creation of this character would only be a ghost to her. And Disney felt pretty scorned by this, saying, "It seems pretty silly from my point of view. I would say that Miss Adams is simply living in the past." So yeah, she didn't want to see his version of Peter Pan.
Okay, she had her reasons. Okay.
So as with all films, again, in 1930s, 1940s, it got shelved at the moment. And then for a number of years, and it wasn't until 1947 that it was fully back in production again as that third movie that they greenlit. So there were a few different alterations from that kind of happened back and forth when they were storyboarding. The first was the nursery scene. The nursery scene had many different alterations of it. And some of it, Miss Darling was one who found Peter Pan rather than Wendy. And others, Nana the dog went with them to Neverland, which is crazy. And then another version, John Darling was left behind for being too serious, but ultimately decided that they thought it would be too sad to leave the third child behind, so he got to go along too. So some things also had to be changed from the stage play, because remember the book was popular, but the stage play was very popular at the time. So one of the big things was what was happening in the stage play. Tinkerbell saves Peter from drinking poison from Captain Hook. So she drinks the poison herself, and the only way she is revived is in the stage play. The audience
Everybody
will applause,
has to clap, right?
and she comes back basically. So of course they were like, well, we can't do that now in a film. It would be a little tricky. So instead they had Captain Hook kidnap her and persuade her to have him tell about Peter's whereabouts. So she just basically doesn't get poisoned, but she's still kidnapped though. So all right. Also, like many other films, again, they used that live action sequencing to help with the animation. And Bobby Driscoll was cast as Peter Pan, making him the first male actor to be portrayed as Peter Pan ever in history at this time. They also used Roland Dupree as a Peter Pan reference to many of the flying and action sequences, since I'm pretty sure Bobby Driscoll was a child, so they didn't want a child flying around on stage, especially back in the 1940s, right? It's like when there were no laws about, safety on set. All right, so animating flying people proved to be challenging, as they're sort of just floating in midair, so that was quite the challenge for them to uncover for this, but obviously they did it.
They did it. They did a good job, too.
Several songs were written for Peter Pan, but the titular song, Second Star to the Right, was actually written for Alice in Wonderland, and then was later reassigned to Peter Pan, which I thought was really interesting. So Peter Pan premiered on February 5th, 1953. It was considered a box office success, earning over $6 million in its first theatrical run. It generally had very positive reviews, like critical reviews at the time, with the only main controversy from the movie was the portrayal of Native Americans in the film. For a while, some of these scenes were actually cut out from the film, but then as of 2021, all of the scenes have been put back into the film as well. And that if you have Disney Plus, you can have age restrictions on like the user. So for instance, like if you have kids, you can have like the kids only age restriction type thing. So if you have a kids only age restriction on your username, there will be like a little pop-up before the film basically saying that certain things in the film are stereotypical of certain ethnicities, of course, and they just to be, aware of that. But of course, they're keeping it in for historical purposes. So but again, that's not on every account though. For instance, I don't have an age restriction on my account, so I don't see that because I think they assume as an adult, you kind of know, right?
Right, you know what you're
But
looking
as a
at.
child, if you're 7 years or younger, you may not know and think that may be normal when it's definitely not. So, all right. So also last thing to note here, that Peter Pan was the last movie Disney used RKO as a distributor before he had created his own distribution company. Sorry. So that was our first 3 for the Silver Era. We have one more for this episode before we then go into part 2. What do you think the next one was that came out in 1955?
Bambi.
It was not Bambi.
I don't know then. What am I missing?
1955. This is my mom's year.
Yeah, but I was born at the end of
I know, right?
1955.
In 1955, Lady and the Tramp came out.
Oh, Lady and the Tramp came out before? Wow, I thought Bambi came out before.
Nope. The inspiration for Lady and the Tramp was back in 1925 when Disney himself gifted his wife Lillian with a chow puppy in a hat box for Christmas. So it was reported that Lillian was very upset with Disney because he was working all these long days in the animation studio, because again, this is back when he was still getting the animation studio up and running. And while Lily had initially expressed disinterest in getting a dog, she was reportedly extremely floored and excited when she was gifted the puppy. The puppy's name is Sunny, with a red ribbon around its neck on. She also reported later on too that she of course forgave Disney because you can't stay mad at Walt for too long. But this real life scene inspired the opening scene of Lady and the Tramp, almost scene for scene, when the woman in Lady and the Tramp unwraps the hat box for Christmas thinking she's getting a hat, and Lady, the puppy, is inside. So in 1937, storyboard artist Joe Grant pitched this as an idea featuring his own dog, an English Springer Spaniel, which is what Lady ended up being. He wanted the story to be told from the dog's perspective, inspired by his own family when they had a baby and the dog kind of got pushed to the side for the baby. Aww. The classic story when you get a real child and then your fur child gets pushed
baby.
to the side.
Sorry.
So Disney loved the initial sketches of Lady and agreed to the project immediately in 1937. Remember, it was Joe Grant who was the one who actually brought it as a fefeature film idea, because again, Disney had done the gifting, but now it was an idea for a film. So like all films, put on hold during World War II, but it was considered, they did consider to do it as a short film in 1943, as again during that wartime package film to like package it up with some of the other films. But ultimately this didn't happen. But some of the ideas for the story's plot floated around during this time. One such idea was to make it more of a buddy film with 2 best friend dogs going on adventures rather than like the more romantic storyline. But again, ultimately that got cut as well. In 1944, Disney had Charles Palmer do a full story treatment for the movie, and much of this outline is basically what we see in the movie today. So Disney is the one who pitched the name Tramp and said that while he's a mongrel, he has to be a neat looking mongrel. as he's their leading man, so he needed to embody Cary Grant, who was a famous male actor at the time. So Ward Green pitched the idea of a romance between the two dogs, and at first no one actually liked the idea of the romance between the dogs. They kind of were thinking more of like that buddy type film, as they thought audiences would find it distasteful and contrary to nature because they were two different dog breeds mainly.
I think they misunderstood people because people just love a dog story.
Disney is also the one who named Lady and the Tramp to be what it was, and many of his writers actually didn't like the name, but he really insisted on calling it Lady and the Tramp since that's what the story was all about.
Right.
And the movie, again, this was still in the 1940s. The movie did go back on hold again for a while, but again, it wasn't until the success of Cinderella and Peter Pan that it got brought back into the limelight and they decided to greenlight it again. So in 1952, it was Roy Disney who encouraged Lady and the Tramp to come back into production, and he said they still needed to keep production costs low and also said they could do a smaller theatrical run with Lady and the Tramp instead. So Disney wasn't sure, so he pitched to his writers and basically had them vote if they were interested in doing Lady or the Tramp or not at this time. And he had a record turnout of writers who said that they were interested in working on Lady and the Tramp. So again, that's actually why it went back into full production, which is interesting because they did so much work on it in the 1940s just for it to get shelved and then for it to come back out. Disney was unsure of it at the time, but again, came back out. So a month later, Lady and the Tramp was back into full production with a $2.5 million budget. And again, some storyboarding was changed, but essentially it was still similar to what we see in the final movie today. All right, so we're going to skip a lot of the casting just for time's sake, but there's a lot of history in who the voice actors in the cast were. But again, I'm just going to skip ahead for some of this just because there was so much that was kind of going on at the time. All right, so in 1945, Joe Grant suggested real animals be brought into the studio as they did with Bambi, which is funny that you said that because Bambi has already come out at this point. But so they did. So
because all these movies, when they came out, like you're talking about when they're all being released, Disney had a habit of putting them in the vault and then re-releasing them a couple of years down the road. So by the time I saw them, they were being re-released.
Again, that's why you
Thank
thought
God
Bambi
I'm not as old as the movies themselves.
I know, but that's just like, it was funny that you mentioned Bambi because Bambi came out in 1942.
Okay.
But anyway, though, so Joe Grant, he wanted to bring in real animals to the studio, again, which they did with Bambi as well. And so they did, including many of the animation studio's own pets as well.
Okay.
So a stray dog was selected to model for Tramp, but he ran away almost instantly, which I thought was really funny. And he wasn't found for days, although they did still use him as a model amongst a few other dogs for Tramp. And then post-filming, that specific dog lived the rest of his life on the pony farm in Disneyland, which I thought was kind of cute. All right, so Frank Thomas was assigned to animate the scene of Lady and the Tramp enjoying a romantic evening. Disney originally disliked the spaghetti scene, but Thomas then redid the scene. He upped the romance of the scene. He animated it fully himself as well at the time. When he showed Disney like more of a final product rather than just a storyboard.
Talk about Disney, an iconic too.
Yeah, Disney liked it a lot better. So the animators still thought that the scene overall slowed down the pacing of the movie too much. So instead they created half numbers between many of the original frames to keep the pace up a bit. All right, so since Lady and the Tramp centered on titular canines, it was decided that the story would be told from the dog's point of view. Since the humans affected the storyline, it was also decided that only showing the hands and feet of the humans was too obvious when framing the action. So they decided that the camera would occasionally show the faces and figures of the humans, but often show them in full view through shadows and silhouettes. So we're really only seeing like the main humans in full figure, so to speak, and then all the other humans.
It's so long, I didn't remember that.
Yeah, there's only a few humans you actually see in full animation detail. The rest, again, silhouettes, hands, feet, things like that. Because again, we're focused on the dogs in this. All right, so Lady and the Tramp was the first full-length feature film to be projected in CinemaScope. This was a really big deal. So without getting into all of the nitty-gritty, because CinemaScope is a type of animation, basically. So I'm not going to go into full details on it because there's like paragraphs and paragraphs on what CinemaScope is. But it changed the way the animators created the background of the scenes. Okay. So this means it allowed for greater realism, but it also meant they could do fewer close-up shots. So in turn, they had to take longer takes as constant jumps in the scenes would be too much for the viewer to see. However, what Disney did not anticipate was that many theaters could not screen a CinemaScope movie because it was in a different aspect ratio than what they were filming before, which was in the Academy ratio. So because of this, they had to go back and have two versions of the movie, both in that Academy ratio and the CinemaScope ratio. And because of this, the animators also had to restructure many of the scenes because if they didn't, characters get cut out of the screen, so to speak. So they had to push the characters close together, essentially, that they would fit on the screen. Yeah. Now, what I find this is interesting is because this is still technically to today where movies get released in multiple aspect ratios, depending upon if you're seeing it in IMAX versus a regular theater versus those super huge IMAX theaters. So just interesting that it's this problem, so to speak, has been around for years and years. We still have that. We still have that now in the 2020s, so to speak, where movies have to be released in multiple aspect ratios. Separately. So, of course, because of having to go back for CinemaScope and the Academy ratio, they missed their original release dates. So several songs were composed for the film, but 8 were ultimately used for the film. film. And then also Disney had Ward Green, so again, one of the main storyboards, write a novelization of the story first published in 1953 to give the audience something familiar to kind of grasp onto. So remember, 1953, this little novel came out, and 1955 is when the movie came out. So the novel, The Lady and the Tramp, The Story of Two Dogs, was published with a foreword by Disney himself. And because of this book, because of this book, the writing credit went to Ward Green. So for the overall movie, because he wrote the book, so to speak, and then the movie came out. But Joe Grant then received no writing credits for Lady and the Tramp. So remember, he was that guy back in 1937 who pitched the idea in the first place to actually make this idea into a feature film.
He didn't get the credit.
So Grant said this was something he never forgave Walt Disney for, as he knew that Walt knew that Joe Grant was the one who came up with the idea, not Ward Green. Again, he was just very, very salty about it, basically. So it wasn't until 2006, so basically everyone's passed away at this point, right? 2006, the animation director Eric Goldberg rectified this and added Joe Grant's name to the making of documentary and into the platinum edition of Lady and the Tramp.
But he wasn't alive at the time?
If he was, I think he was very old. So, all right, so before the movie officially came out, they aired 2 TV episodes about the making of the film, featuring many of the main animators, as well as featuring some of the songs as well. This was all done to help promote the movie. So again, like these little TV episodes and the novel, which is very interesting because if you think about it, up until now, almost all of the full-length feature films that Disney had created were all based on something else. And this was the first original idea, so to speak. That's right.
They were all based on some kind
almost all of them were based on a book or a novel previously written, or like, again, a stage play such as Peter Pan that people already had been aware of, familiar with, were interested in seeing the movie.
Was a new one. Huh.
So again, other than some of the shorts and Fantasia, of course, which was pretty unique, but again, Fantasia was a very different type of movie. It was more of music set to animation. Again, first full-length feature film that was completely original in that sense. So Disney didn't have any preconceived notion of how popular the idea may be, and clearly wanted his ideas to be introduced to an audience before the movie came out, just so that way you kind of warm up the audience first for the idea of Lady and the Tramp before you produce this like $4 million movie on it, right? So again, just really interesting, because I think it's like one of those things today where people are like, we want original films and we want original things and we're doing all these remakes and everything. And it's like, that's actually how the animation studio started, now didn't it? Was turning books into movies. So it's like that idea has been around since the dawn of time. So not saying original ideas are bad,
I don't think a lot of people are yelling about turning books into movies. I think a lot of people are yelling about taking an old movie and redoing it again with just new characters.
Yeah. So Lady and the Tramp was released on June 16th, 1955, and earning a whopping $6.5 million. It was considered an immediate success. It did receive some mixed reviews at the times, and the main criticism for Lady and the Tramp was for stereotyping Asian ethnicities through the Siamese cat characters.
Oh, the Siamese cats, right.
Now, again, the movie was still a hit and still received high praise throughout the years.
Yes.
I think in a way, the Siamese cat characters helped in the sense that they were cats, it wasn't humans. So for instance, in Peter Pan, the Native Americans were humans portraying Native American humans. Yes. So it was a little bit more stereotypical rather than cats.
There was no misunderstanding. They were Asian.
Yes. So again, that I would say that was the biggest the biggest thing. Yeah. To the point when they did the live action Lady and the Tramp years later, and like I think it was like 2021, they did cut out the cats from that live action. Yeah.
I love those kitties.
All right, so that is the first 4 films of the Silver Era. We still have 4 more films to go, so we'll have that in part 2. But first, let's just do a quick few fun facts that I didn't put in the other things just to have them here. So, all right, the first fun fact I'm so excited to talk about. So, in the original feature film script of Cinderella, everyone basically had different names for the most part, right? So, Cinderella's stepmother was named Florimel de la Pochelle, which is wild. Her stepsisters were Wanda and Jovat. They had very French names, which is interesting. And then this is what gets me, right? So, in the original, let's step back for a second real quick into my personal life. I recently adopted a small gray kitten, and I wanted to name this gray cat Lucifer after the cat in Cinderella. When I pitched it to my husband, he actually really liked the name Lucifer. It was one of our top names along what we ended up naming my cat. And so it made it all the way to the end, and then we ended up going with the other name instead. And so it's funny because my other cat, his name is Morocco, and she's named after the Moroccan Pavilion in Epcot. And so some of my friends even said too, was like, oh, you don't have like your cat named after something Disney or a location or something like that. But come to find out, the original name for Gus Gus in Cinderella was Dusty.
Oh, which really?
Is wild. And that is when I named my cat was Dusty.
Kitty, Dusty.
So his original name when I was reading this, I had to read it twice to make sure that I wasn't making this up. But yeah, the original name for Gus Gus was Dusty. And again, all of the other...
Have you told Ted that yet?
I did tell him. He thought that was wild.
He still got a
First
Disney
of all,
name.
he thought it was pretty... First of all, he thought it was pretty snide of me to try to name cat Lucifer after a Disney name, because he didn't know it was Lucifer was the cat in Cinderella. But little did he know, we picked the name Dusty, not even knowing.
You didn't even know at the time.
I didn't know, yeah. Okay. So it's like not me having like a deep cut name.
Can't get away from it.
For Disney.
Still a Disney name.
Yeah, but Gus's original name was Disney in the original script for the film. And then all the names got changed, of course, later on to different names, of course. Okay. But again, I just thought that was so exciting, that Dusty's middle name.
Okay.
There was also a pet turtle named Clarissa. And then the stepsisters had a cat that Lucifer's first name was Bon Bob, which I thought was interesting. Okay. The prince's aide's name was Spink, and then the stepsisters' dancing instructor was Monsieur Carnuel, which that character completely got cut anyway. So again, a lot of different names that were in the original script for sure that all got changed. Literally every name got changed.
I think once they probably looked at the animation, you do something, you want it all to like sort of flow. Yeah.
I think too, they want to give all the mice like human names too, because they were, rather than giving them like naming him, Tubby Little Mouse Dusty, like giving him a name as Gus, which is a very cute name too. Which is funny because I did pitch Gus to Ted as well when we got Dusty. Yeah. But having Gus's name would be Dusty, I thought that was so funny. So I was like, look at that. He does have a Disney name.
He ended up with a Disney name anyway.
All right. So another fun fact is nearly 380 applicants applied to voice Cinderella, with Jeannie McKeon originally being cast and announced, but eventually the deal didn't work out and Eileen Woods was cast and was the voice of Cinderella as we know it. Disney said that the dress transformation scene that Mark Davis created was his favorite piece of animation. I love that. I love that so much.
Into the gown.
Yeah, it's like that. That is his favorite piece of animation. I think that's my favorite piece of animation too. It is so beautiful and so classic to this day. All right, so Mary Blair, the infamous, she was one of the original art directors for Lady and the Tramp, which I think would have been really interesting if Lady and the Tramp had that same style as like what Cinderella was. And she even did many of the inspirational sketches for the film, but she soon left the studio as a whole because she wanted to become a children's book illustrator in 1953. All right, and then just a few more fun facts. An early script of Lady and the Tramp had the story taking place in San Francisco during the 1906 earthquake, and it was later changed to the turn of the century New England, which Disney resonated with more. He reflected on how he remembered in his own small town in Missouri in 1908 how they only had 2 cars, and that slowly over time now cars were just normal, right? Everyone has a car. But he says he remembered as a kid there was only 2 cars in my town, and I'm like, I can't even picture that, right? Because I've grown up in a time with cars. Right. So all right, and last but not least is a fun little scandal, right? So Lady and the Tramp had a lawsuit, right, with Peggy Lee. Peggy Lee was the main songwriter for the music of the movie, and she also voiced some of the characters in the movie too. So she signed a contract with Disney way back when that they couldn't make transcriptions of her work for the public without her approval. So she claimed that when the movie went to VHS tape in 1987, that she should receive royalties for this, and that because she received no royalties for this, the Disney company had breached her contract. Long story short, there's a lot on this legal lawsuit between the two of them. She was awarded $2.3 million in contract breach and another $1.4 million in other like illegal uses of her voice and her name, since she was the main songwriter for these songs. Then in 1992, the Disney company also had to pay her another $3 million in compensation, as at this point video cassettes were also out. So even though video cassettes did not exist when she signed her contract with Disney back in the 1940s, 1950s, she still retained the rights to the phonograph recordings and transcriptions of the film. And the Los Angeles County Superior Court ruled in her favor that video cassettes were a type of transcription that she should receive the royalties. Yep. I thought that was really interesting because I feel like that just talks about the innovation of the time, right?
Right, because,
how
just
were they
signed
supposed to know in the 1950s?
Then you just signed a contract. She had a really good lawyer who set up that contract.
That's what I'm saying. Is like back in the 1950s is like, again, fast forward 40 years later. It's like, even when you think about that now too, it's like the technology we have now, and 40 years from now, who knows what that technology is going to be. So just very interesting.
Just anticipating.
And I'll say too, this is not the only lawsuit of the Silver Era. So we will get into that into part 2. So thank you for listening to part 1 right now. So I guess I have no Disney news. I'm going to do Disney news in part 2, but we can do maybe a quick Disney memory if you want before we skip over to part 2.
The Disney memory was just seeing these movies because, like I said, I did not see them when they came out. Obviously, I'm not that old. But when they came out, they were re-released. So for me, when they first came out, I was a kid. So to me, I didn't know they were out 5-7 years ago. As far as I was concerned, I was seeing them for the first time. This was the first time that they were doing anything. So it was just so amazing to see them. Well, my mother took me to all these Disney movies, and you go see these Disney movies, and it was just amazing to see the animation and the animals and the things. And I saw them when I was a kid. So, and I thought in my mind, the first one I actually saw was Bambi.
Bambi, yeah.
In my mind, that's a long time ago, but in my mind, the first animated Disney movie I saw was Bambi. Yeah. So that the re-release date obviously coincided with me being old enough to go to the movies and see it. So Bambi was the first one I saw.
No, that makes sense. All right. Thanks everyone for listening to part 1 of the Silver Era. Again, if you're listening in real time, next Monday, part 2 will be released. And if you're listening in the future, it should already be released, right? So skip over to part 2 now. But otherwise, make sure you give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. And again, on our social media, Almost Amanda X is where you'll be able to see, again, any updates we kind of have going on with the podcast. And again, Almost Amanda X, named after Alice in Wonderland. So, all right, we'll see you all real soon.